By the end of the 11th century, Europe was restless. Lords warred with neighbors, knights spilled blood for land and glory, and peasants bent beneath hunger and toil. Yet beyond the horizon, tales drifted west. Tales of the Holy Land, where Christ had walked, now under the banner of Islam. Pilgrims whispered of desecrated shrines, of danger on the roads to Jerusalem. In 1095, in the French town of Clermont, all those whispers became a roar. Before a crowd of thousands, Pope Urban II lifted his arms. His words were fire. Brothers of Christ, rise up. Your brethren in the east cry for aid. Jerusalem, the holy city, lies in bondage. Take up the cross, fight the infidel, and reclaim what is ours. Deus vult, God wills it. The crowd erupted. Men wept. Knights tore their cloaks, sewing crude crosses upon their chests. Peasants vowed to march barefoot to Jerusalem. Sinners sought absolution. Kings sought crowns. And wanderers sought destiny. The first crusade had been born. Across Europe, armies gathered, not one but many. Princes of France, dukes of Lorraine, counts of Flanders. Thousands of peasants followed them, driven not by strategy but blind zeal. They called it the People's Crusade, led by a fiery preacher named Peter the Hermit. But zeal alone could not withstand Turkish blades. In Anatolia, the people's host was cut down, their blood soaking foreign soil. Yet the princes pressed on. The march was brutal, sun scorched, food dwindled, and rivers ran with disease. Yet the cross-bearers endured. They fought their way through Anatolia, stormed Antioch after a siege that nearly starved them to death. And by 1099, they stood before the walls of Jerusalem. For 40 days they battered the city. On July 15th, the Crusaders breached. To them, it was the fulfillment of God's promise. To their enemies, it was a nightmare written in blood. Jerusalem was theirs. Upon its throne they crowned Godfrey of Bouillon, not as king, for he said no man should wear a crown where Christ wore thorns, but as protector of the Holy Sepulchre. The world stood in awe. A band of weary knights had carved a kingdom from the ashes of faith and fury, but victories born in blood never last. Beyond the horizon, a greater storm was gathering. For nearly a century, the Crusader states clung to the Holy Land, fragile islands of Latin rule in a sea of Islamic power. Castles rose at Antioch, Acre, and Edessa, fortresses of stone bristling with crosses and banners. But unity was fleeting. Crusader lords quarreled, dynasties fought, and greed corroded zeal. In 1187, the storm arrived. From the deserts of Mesopotamia, a leader emerged, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin. A warrior of faith and mercy, he united fractured Muslim lands under one banner. At Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee, Saladin's army surrounded the Crusaders. The burning sun, the choking dust, the dwindling water, all conspired against the Knights of the Cross. Surrounded, desperate, they broke. Saladin seized the relic of the true cross and slaughtered the foe. Jerusalem, the jewel of Christendom, fell into his hands. Europe gasped. Christ's city was lost. The cry for a new crusade echoed through Europe. Among those who answered was Richard I of England, the Lionheart. Fierce in battle, unyielding in courage, Richard embodied the ideal of the knight. Alongside Philip II of France and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, he launched the Third Crusade. Barbarossa drowned before reaching the Holy Land. Philip quarreled and departed. but Richard pressed on. His campaign became legend. At Acre, after a 2-year siege, the Lion... Again and again Richard struck, his banner a roar across the Levant. Yet for all his victories, Jerusalem eluded him. The holy city's walls, guarded by Saladin's will and God's grace, never yielded. But here history sings of something greater than blood. Richard and Saladin, though enemies, grew to respect each other. Saladin once sent Richard fruit and snow to ease his fever. Richard once praised Saladin's honor above all men. They fought not as beasts, but as kings, bound by a strange chivalry that bridged faiths. At last, in 1192, weary of endless war, Richard and Saladin made peace. Christians would not reclaim Jerusalem, but pilgrims could walk its streets in safety. The crusade ended without triumph, but with dignity. Richard sailed home, a prisoner of fate. Saladin returned to Damascus, a lion of Islam, dying not on a throne of gold but in a humble bed, leaving barely enough wealth for his burial. The Third Crusade was no simple war. It was a song of giants, Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, warriors whose courage and honor outshone even their swords. Their clash would echo through the centuries as the most legendary duel of the Crusades. But the holy fire was not yet quenched. New crusades would rise, driven by greed, betrayal, and blood, and one would strike not at Islam, but at Christendom itself. By the dawn of the 13th century, the cry of Deus Vult still echoed across Europe, but its meaning had begun to wither. No longer was every knight driven by faith alone. Now kings and lords sought gold, thrones, and power under the guise of the cross. In 1202, the Fourth Crusade was called. The goal? Reclaim Jerusalem once more. But from its first breath, destiny twisted. The Crusaders struck a bargain with Venice, whose doge demanded payment in ships and silver. Lacking gold, the Crusaders offered steel. Their first target was not Muslim, but Christian. At the urging of Venice, the Crusaders attacked Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic. Cross clashed with cross, church against church. Pope Innocent III thundered in outrage, excommunicating the entire host. Yet the crusade marched on, unbowed. Already the purity of the holy cause was poisoned. Soon after, a Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, approached the Crusaders with promises of untold wealth if they restored him to the throne of Constantinople. The offer was irresistible. The greatest Christian city of the East, seat of emperors and splendor, now became their target. In 1204, the armies of the Cross stood before the Theodosian walls, defenses that had repelled centuries of siege. With Venetian ships and Western steel, they breached them. What followed was one of the darkest hours of Christendom. For 3 days, Crusaders looted, burned, and slaughtered. Ancient relics were smashed, churches desecrated, golden mosaics torn from walls. Horses drank from the baptismal font of Hagia Sophia. Priests were struck down at their altars. 1,000 years of empire was undone in a storm of greed. From the ruins, the Crusaders carved the Latin Empire of Constantinople, a hollow kingdom ruled by Western lords. But it was a shadow of what they destroyed. The Byzantine Empire, though it endured in exile, would never fully recover. This was no holy war. It was betrayal of faith, of brotherhood, of Christendom itself. The cross had become a banner of conquest and plunder, and its purity was forever scarred. Yet still, the dream of Jerusalem lingered. More crusades would come, each weaker than the last, and with every failure, the light of the Crusader kingdoms dimmed. After the disaster of Constantinople, The crusading spirit staggered on, but its glory had faded. Crusades were launched against heretics in Europe, pagans in the Baltic, and Muslims in Egypt. Yet Jerusalem remained beyond reach. The Crusader states, once proud, shrank to fragile outposts along the coast. Antioch weakened, Tripoli fractured, and Jerusalem long since lost. Only Acre stood strong, a fortress of stone where cross and crescent watched each other across battlements. By the late 13th century, Muslim power had grown unstoppable. The mighty Mamluks of Egypt, hardened warriors who had once been slaves, swept north under Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil. Their target was clear: Acre, the last jewel of the Crusaders. In 1291, the Mamluk army thundered against its walls. Catapults hurled fire, towers creaked, drums pounded. Inside, knights of the temple and hospital braced for the storm, swearing to die before yielding. For weeks the siege raged. Towers crumbled, walls cracked, blood soaked the earth. The Templars fought like lions, holding breaches with sword and shield, their white mantles darkened with blood. Women and children fled to the ships in the harbor, praying to escape the slaughter. At last, the Mamluks stormed the city. Streets burned, churches toppled, and the Red Cross was torn from its banners. The survivors fled to Cyprus. Those who remained met the sword. The Crusader dream in the Holy Land was finished. Acre was gone. For nearly 2 centuries, knights and kings had marched under the banner of the cross. They had captured Jerusalem. They had fought giants like Saladin and titans like Richard the Lionheart. But in the end, the Holy Land slipped from their grasp. The Crusades left behind a legacy of blood and legend. They reshaped trade, deepened rifts between East and West, and carved stories of valor and betrayal that still echo. As the smoke rose over Acre, the Crusader kingdoms were no more. The holy fire had burned itself out. Europe turned inward, and the East stood resolute. Yet in song and story, the Crusades endured. Not just as wars of faith, but as epics of humanity, of courage and cruelty, of saints and sinners, of kings and peasants bound together by a cry that once shook the earth. Deus vult.